Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast. And this week, as we wind down the year, I can't believe we've only got about 4 episodes left till the end of the year. And the latest books are hitting the shelves. We're turning the pages of a brilliant new book that's as sweeping as it is provocative. And the author clearly has some kind of insight into the future because many of the predictions that were made in the book are actually starting to come true. It's called The Spell. It's the story of human progress and how the West lost its soul. Not an easy book to summarize. It's philosophy, it's history, it's politics, it's popular culture, all woven together. One moment you're reading about Jamal Khashoggi's murder, or the tension of an investigative journalist recounting the story, and the next you're pulled into a meditation on Superman or Apocalypse Now as allegories of moral collapse. The book has been divided into 5 sections. It's each named after one of Hesiod's 5 ages of man. It's a structural choice that really mirrors the recurring rise and decline that underpins the broader historical sweep and narrative. And across these 5 parts, the book has developed 2 long and continuous narratives that are interwoven throughout. You've got the Malthusian narrative and the story of Western philosophy, which really all follow the shifting understandings of truth, morality, and human nature from antiquity through to modernity. And we're joined this week by one of the authors, David Buckham, whose last book, Orthogonal Thinking, was longlisted for the Sunday Times Literary Award. David, welcome. And I've got to say, after reading the book, reading the manuscripts, and going through the launches with you, it was so interesting because one of the issues you raise is around Mohammed bin Salman. And you've long said that this idea of NEOM is just a complete pipe dream. And lo and behold, last week in the FT, there's a story here. I'm going to read the headline, End of the Line. How Saudi Arabia's NEOM dream unraveled. So that must give you a great deal of satisfaction that a lot of what you were ringing the warning bell on is starting to pass.
Yes, Michael, thank you so much for noticing that. When I saw that article, I took great pleasure. I guess a bit of a guilty pleasure. And I think we live in a world where I will never forget reading The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he describes the scene where, you've got mass starvation in the USSR because of the collectivism of food. And one of the interior ministers goes out to this external town and they're all starving to death, but they've got grain in the tower, but it's been centralized to Moscow. So people are starving to death and he makes a speech and he gives a speech about how great the Maoist central government is, not the Maoist, anyway, what happens is in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's account, there's a standing ovation and then it kind of becomes ridiculous in that no one stops clapping because God forbid you be the first person to stop. And I was in my early 20s when I read this. And then someone sat down eventually because it was getting silly. And that person was then the next day sent to the Gulag. And I imagine that those people who surround Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, including but not limited to all of the Western consulting firms and all of the bankers from Switzerland and from England and from America, and all of the people who hang off his every word, because if you get anything wrong, you get beheaded, all allowed this child of a man to design something that's physically and economically unviable for no reason other than that he had a kind of 8-year-old fantasy in his head that he got out of probably a movie made by James Cameron.
Yeah.
But this completely ridiculous project that we investigated like 2 years ago and we've been tracing. Now, this is a project that's meant to cost $500 billion, which includes a city that is built on a line which is roughly 200 meters wide, 500 to 800 meters high, because it has varying levels, but 160 kilometers long, which if you think about it, doesn't really make sense from a city design perspective. It was meant to cost $500 billion, be completed by 2030. It's now already cost $50 billion and is already a failure. Even the most basic elements have failed. So that $50 billion is wasted. It's now estimated to be $4.5 trillion. They're still carrying on with it because no one can say no to MBS. And it's 4.5 times the total value of the Saudi investment fund. So when a country led by a child has a project of that magnitude fail, it kind of makes me feel somewhat vindicated, because I have felt like I've been warning people for some time. This is not a country to partner with. This is not a country to hold peace negotiations in. This is not a country that should be in the mix of discussions, because it's run by a person who's not making rational decisions.
Yeah. Yet we have the West cozying up to Saudi Arabia. We have local fund managers that manage trillions of rands of investments, saying that Riyadh feels like Beijing circa 1987 in that it's opening up. And again, why, and you touched on this in orthogonal thinking, it's so important to challenge these grand narratives and idea trains that we have. And we can't just be unquestioning around the way the world is structured geopolitically. I found it fascinating as a thread and as a theme through the book. One of my favorite sections or themes actually was the Malthusian narrative, tracing this idea that suffering and scarcity, resource constraint is somehow natural and has persisted since the 18th century. And I mean, you just used the example of communist central planning and how many deaths Stalin and Lenin were responsible for because of the that central planning and the famines. But what surprised you most in that research on Thomas Malthus when you first started chipping away? Because you initially had this idea that this was really at the center of so much that ails us today.
Yes, I mean, it was an inkling that I had 3 years ago where I spoke to Robin and said, I'm pretty sure that I can feel the echo of Malthusian thinking in the climate change narrative. So when you have someone say things like there's an existential crisis, or like Bill Gates suggested in his book on climate change, a climate disaster, or that you have people from the United Nations or from the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, say things like John Kerry said, we should not let the war in Ukraine distract us from the impending existential crisis that is climate change. It has a tone or an echo of Malthusian thinking. And what surprised us was that not only is that a true statement, but we are not living in the only period of time where Malthusian thinking, which is, for the listener, Malthusian thinking is that population growth is faster than the food production rate, the rate of food production, and we're all going to starve to death eventually because we're going to be overrun by overpopulation. Now, most people, even today, believe that the world is overpopulated. And they don't understand, most people don't understand that we actually face a different problem, which is that the world is getting old.
Yeah.
And that there are too few young people. And that's a far bigger problem than the world being overpopulated. But the concept has been propagated throughout history. Even World Bank lending, I mean, the World Bank lent money at high rates of interest to very impoverished countries, and insisted that if they took the loans, they had to implement population control measures, including, but not limited to, mass sterilizations. So imagine being forced as an individual in a poor country to be sterilized so that your country could get billions of dollars of loans that you could never pay back.
Yeah.
And that was done in over 30 countries.
Yeah.
That's just one example. I mean, there's examples during the Irish famine of Malthusian thinking, where the British refused to help the Irish, that let them die because they're a victim of their own vice, which is they had too much sex. You also see this. I don't know, Michael, if you've ever heard someone say Well, COVID came for a reason.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. It was a
Really
common line.
awful.
Yeah. There's almost a moral justification along with this. It's a weaponization of economic logic, or what is deemed to be economic logic of the time. And you suggest that these ideas, in fact, I think you demonstrate quite palpably that these ideas can kill, that abstract philosophies of body counts. And to an extent, I feel that is what the spell is exposing at its core as well.
Yes. I mean, the attempt that we make in the spell, if you attempt to have a conversation with someone, let's say one of my family members, let's say one of the family members dearest to me, like my father, we have this argument about the world is overpopulated and that we're destroying the planet. And therefore we should take these measures, and you end up kind of in an argument that goes nowhere. Like T.S. Eliot puts it, in these endless arguments, in his brilliant poem, The Wasteland. So the idea of the spell was to not have the argument and to show the reader the information and the storylines in a palatable way so that the reader could make their own conclusions. I could give an example, if you would like,
please,
of how, had someone read the spell, it might have helped them make a better decision. So a very good example for me is recently announced that Porsche had, the CEO of 9 years had resigned, and they've got a new CEO who's ex-McLaren, which is not exactly the most successful financial venture on the planet.
No.
And you must remember that Porsche was like the darling of the VW group. And whilst only having about 317,000 sales in 2022 of cars, made up a very small percentage of the VW's total sales, made up a significant proportion of their profit, up to 25%. So they decided to spin it off and list it 2 years ago. And its initial valuation was up to $100 billion. Porsche, just in the last 2 years, has suffered a number of sort of self-inflicted wounds, which have resulted in its share valuation being 60% declined, is now worth $40 billion.
Yeah.
And possibly will go lower than that if you consider that $40 billion valuation is on top of 300,000 cars. Now, the reason for the failure of Porsche's share IPO is that they pivoted very strongly towards selling cars in China and towards EVs only.
Yeah.
So, for example, their best-selling model, the Macan, which is like this fantastic hybrid car, they've decided that the next generation should only be EVs. But they did not anticipate that the demand for EVs would decline, number one, because of the price point. Number two, that China would oversupply.
Yeah.
And number three, that they were not actually technologically as advanced as the Chinese in making EVs. Now they've got a problem in that the Macan factories that have been repurposed to only build EV versions cannot suddenly be changed. It will take them 2-3 years to reintroduce petrol engines, which is not politically popular in Germany. So they kind of got themselves stuck in a pretty bad position from being in a really good position. Yeah. They had a GP margin, operating margin of 18%, which is now down to 2%, if not less.
Yeah.
To reverse track is very difficult, all because they fully bought in to the environmentalist narrative that everything was going to be EV driven, which is simply a narrative that was propagated by the Chinese Communist Party and by Tesla to suit themselves, because they had a stranglehold on the supply of the raw materials that make up EVs.
I mean, one could argue that the German industrial motor manufacturing complex was caught flat-footed, like Porsche. But I mean, you could apply that to many of the other German OEMs. You look at Mercedes, you look at BMW at the moment, you look at Audi. A lot of investments in EV technology. I think they also lost a lot of their industrial spark and innovation. One could argue as well, but because of the labor dynamics in Germany, where the workers through the Mittelstand model as well have a lot of say on these company boards, and they probably weren't able to build the adjacent supply chains and the scale that the Chinese built up in the EV industry. If you look at the Chinese having arm locks on, the manufacture of key components for the lithium batteries that go and the the components that go into these EVs, no one can compete with the Chinese at scale. But German economic policy, they shut down their nuclear plants, they shut down a lot of their coal plants, and they gave up their energy security that Vladimir Putin then seized upon when he invaded Ukraine. And again, all of that does come back down to being beholden to a particular narrative. So would you say that's how you would apply this spell in your own life?
Yes, yeah. So if I was to, for example, we have the G20 conference about to take place in South Africa. And just very, very simple things like driving through Sandton can be quite frustrating over the last couple of months, which is, I hear my house is near the president's house in Joburg. So every night I have his helicopter fly over my head. And it's very frustrating because when I drive from my house to the office in Sandton, I have to drive in the single lane, which has been made into this like awful single lane with all the building and the taxis, and which is the Ria Vaya project. And then suddenly it occurred to me, why would the Ria Vaya project be suddenly reinvigorated now? And then I got it. It's to show off for the G20. So you've got to show off some infrastructure. So even in the simplest frustrating moment of sitting in traffic, I find the concept of the spell very useful, because the G20 itself is to a large degree a function of a narrative, which is that we live now in a multipolar world. This is the new narrative that replaces the old narrative. We used to live in a unipolar world driven by America the Great.
Yeah.
America has rejected the rest of the world. America has said, make America great again. They've done what they said they were going to do.
They are not attending the G20. I mean,
they've isolated themselves. So the G20 is a display of this multipolar power that's made up of the rest of the G20, which is including countries that are not necessarily liberal democracies, that are showing off their infrastructure. So suddenly we need to show off our infrastructure. So I can apply the spell in that way. Another way that I think one can apply the spell is to question what it is to be human. And so that sounds very abstract. But if I now question, well, I'm hearing that computers, technology, AI is going to overwhelm us and take our jobs away and replace us as humans. And then easily sucked into the narrative because, everyone's using ChatGPT and everyone's discussing AI, and AI is an acronym in just about every company's byline now.
Yeah.
Even if you don't know what it is. And that's very easy to get sucked into. And people talk about this as if it's a fact that there will be super intelligence and what's called AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. And I've read many articles which say that this is happening. It's, just about everyone has adopted this narrative, except I can see some break in the narrative. So, for example, this particular individual who heads up Meta's AI lab, their leading lab, has resigned and he's going to start his own super intelligence company. This was announced just a few days ago. And he's made the statement that large language models are useful, but are nowhere near super intelligent. And, there's a lot of kind of technical understanding that one needs to dig through the morass of, BS to understand, that the way that large language models are trained, the way that they're built, they appear to be useful. It's very popular to say that AI will be the future, but it's a narrative, and you have to really force yourself to think, well, what if it weren't true? And if you look at, I'm sure you've seen this, Michael, the amount of money that they're spending on
data centers and
data centers, and suddenly this concern about carbon emissions is not so great.
And I don't know if you've seen, someone follows how many times they mention AI during S&P 500 earnings calls, and they've tracked it. And in this Q3 earnings season, the mention of AI has surpassed 10,000 for the first time in history. So this is the top 500 companies in the US. Not all of them have reported. We've probably got about 80%. So you're talking about over 400 companies. You've got 10,000 mentions of AI. That figure has doubled over the last 18 months. The previous record was set at the end of June. That was 9,000. And to put that into perspective, AI was cited just 1,000 times during the 3-month period ending March 2023. So everything is AI right now, to your point, supporting that narrative. And I, like you, am very concerned when narratives just become detached from rational logic and economic rationality. If you just look at the fact that the amount of money that is being raised in debt to fund these CapEx programs on data centers and the associated energy and other infrastructure dwarfs anything that we've seen. I've seen it likened probably to the railroad era in terms of CapEx spending in the US. And the problem is with the way these companies are now accounting for the technology, they're depreciating these chips, the Blackwell chips that NVIDIA produce over 4 to 6 years, when quite clearly, I think DeepSeek showed us that, these things probably depreciate over 12 to 24 months. So they're artificially inflating their profits as well. The famous short seller Michael Avery, who foresaw the global financial crisis, has come out of his hibernation and he's taken a very public short now on NVIDIA and Palantir.
Yes, I would totally agree with him. I mean, I'm more of a commentator than an investor, but I mean, I would definitely short the top 10 S&P 500 stocks, all 10 of them. Maybe not one of the great banks, but I would short NVIDIA, I would short Meta, and I mean, Palantir definitely Microsoft. And there's a very simple reason for it, is what's really happening, if you look at the numbers, is that the investments that they're making are all based on a fundamental assumption, is that the bigger your data center, the more processing that you can do, the better your large language model will be. And then this is a race for market domination. So the first to get there will be Google or Microsoft, and Meta is behind. So it's investing and taking greater risks. And it will be one of these 3 or 4 big players that end up having market domination. Probably, if I had to bet on it, I would say Google or Microsoft. Those would be my 2 top bets. But it doesn't really matter because it's a race to the bottom, because the assumption is incorrect. The relative net benefit of more data centers and more power to the NVIDIA chips or the Blackwell chips is not self-evident to me. We've already achieved something like the best version that we can get for the money. In other words, if you spend another $100, you're not going to get another $100 better. If you think about how good OpenAI is at, generally speaking, helping us with some basic tasks, I don't see that the spending that they're talking about, which is in the trillions of dollars, will make trillions of dollars of difference to all of those companies. Only one of them will benefit. So you could short them all and you'll make money on your shorts and you'll lose on one, probably.
Yeah, I agree with that. Increasingly, I think investors, hedge funds, those who follow the market very closely are starting to question this narrative in particular. But I want to come back to how this contextualizes itself within the spell, because it's quite interesting when you think of, and you were chatting to me the other day, you had a cover of Scientific American, and it's a special edition on the quantum realm on the cover, why we might live in a multiverse. And I mean, I look at that and I think this is Scientific American saying we could live in a Marvel comic book multiverse fantasy. It feels like we no
Yes.
longer live in a scientific world. I mean, if science itself
Yes.
begins to flirt with metaphysics, what does that do to the idea of truth?
I'm so glad you're asking this question, because I think, Michael, in the many conversations we've had, the one area where we battled to agree was on what is science. And I feel like we're clarifying the point now in the argument between ourselves, you and I, which is, I'm not saying that science is bad. I'm not saying that science isn't amazing. I'm not saying that science isn't the drive of human progress. I'm saying that the way that science is consumed, the way that policy is written around science, the way that science is propagated in the media is a narrative that has become very unscientific. So I have this concept of, from my training in mathematics, pure mathematics, this concept of the difference between what's called analytical mathematics versus quantitative mathematics.
Yeah.
So analytical mathematics means that I'm able to create a proof which is analytical, which is a closed form solution that proves, not beyond reasonable doubt, that proves full stop mathematically that, the square root of 2 is irrational, not rational. That's analytical mathematics. What all of this technology, so-called technology and science, is the models that are driving climate change policy. Those models are all ARIMA models, autoregressive integrated moving average models. They're all ARCH models, autoregressive conditional heteroscedastic models that are not scientific models. They're models like what we used to model credit default swaps before the great crash, which we don't talk about anymore. These highly quantitative models are the same models that are used to build large language models, are the same models that are used to build blockchain. So I'm seeing the propagation, on the one hand, of this is scientific endeavor. This is not scientific at all.
Yeah.
This is quantitative methodologies that are, if you look on my bookshelf, I've got quantitative methods. It's things that, little tricks that we use in mathematics, not even in maths. It's basically, tomorrow will look something like today plus a little bit of change. These are like Black-Scholes models.
Yeah.
This is not scientific. And the irony becomes how far we veer away from any kind of idea of science itself, so that we reach a point where we're really good at building telescopes. We're really bad at making use of the observations. And then we make machines. So brute force has replaced science. That's why you have these data centers that have proliferated throughout the world and popping up, crunching words into the tokenization of words and phrases to create large language models is not that different, in my mind, to the concept of mass consensus agreement on cryptocurrency. It's just using integrated circuits to burn through many, many, many data points to mimic what the human brain does without an actual understanding of what the human brain actually does.
Yeah, and that mimicry leads to a loss of meaning. And you see it when you can automatically detect something that's been written by AI. Things lose context. There's a human underlying element. And this concept of what does all of this mean at the end of the day for our own humanness, for our concept of our moral center of what a soul is. And I think for all its critique, the spell ends on a surprisingly hopeful note on the kind of Viktor Frankl-like searching for meaning in a chaotic world. And how you do that is, and you've said to me in the past that your children become your meaning. It's a profoundly personal statement for a book so large in scope. Just as we end off, David, when you look at the spell and the journey that you've undertaken through the process of writing this, how fundamentally has it changed you, and where do you go to from here? Are we expecting a spell 2.0? Because I've looked at this and I've thought there's so many different conversations that we could have around the spell.
Well, yeah, I think it's fundamentally changed me. It's confirmed what I had as inklings into. I'm now pretty certain that I'm right in the sense that we do live under a spell in one form or another. And I think where to from here is, Michael, we are going to continue the Under the Spell podcast, which I'm very much expecting and hoping you, Michael, to be at the front and center of. And we're going to have, just for this audience, the idea of the Under the Spell podcast would be to have detailed, curated conversations about simple questions that have complex answers, like, should the world pivot back to nuclear energy? Is that not the answer to the problem of the environment? And is not the risk of nuclear less than the risk of carbon? Yeah. That's the one question I would like answered in one detailed discussion with a physicist or a nuclear physicist. I would also very much like to understand, what does it mean if you agree with Foucault? Yeah. So if you agree with Foucault and his observations, which are very well argued by Foucault and by all of his acolytes in liberal universities, where will you derive your source of moral centeredness? Where is morality in all of that? How do you know right from wrong? Then I want to have you, Michael, interview a philosopher on that question. And I think that's the kind of conversation that we're going to have next year, once a week. And then once a month, you and I are going to just spitball and talk total rubbish to each other. Joe Rogan style.
I think you've teed it up beautifully. The cat is now out the bag. I can officially say that we will be launching Under the Spell in 2026. Cannot wait to get stuck into it. I mean, Michel Foucault, one of the key founders of postmodern thought, started his career as a Marxist. He joined the French Communist Party. He broke with them. He became a Maoist during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And if you look at what he's done, he's taught generations of students that morality, reason, reality itself are just social constructs, that the foundation of everything is relative and just perspectives. And I think these have been used to chip away largely at Western ideals. I mean, that's my personal view. We're gonna intersperse these conversations with strong opinion, but we're going to ground them as far as possible in fact, with the idea to seek the truth. And I think it's important to put that down, because I recall Steve Mitchell, your head of marketing at Monocle, when he sat down and interviewed me on the spell. And he asked me, as a journalist, how do you arrive at objectivity in your craft, given that there is so much contested idea and thought out there? And it really got me thinking after the interview, as much as during the conversation. But what we should strive for is not necessarily objectivity, but we should strive to find the truth between these competing narratives as far as possible as we can. And if that means some might accuse us of not being objective and being subjective, well then, so be it. So I think that is going to be our lodestar as we go under the spell in 2026.
Yes.
David, love chatting to you as always.
Thank you, Mike.
You really get the synapses firing, and I think that is the highest compliment that one could ever pay any author. You force the reader to grapple, to think, and to hold up the mirror to themselves. So congratulations. I'm sure it's going to be a number one through the Christmas period. And you'll see it out at exclusive books, all good bookstores. Go get a copy of The Spell. David Buckham, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's all the time we have on the Monocle Banking Podcast this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. Remember, you can get the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, on Spotify, Apple, YouTube. And do join us next week when we go under the hood of retail banking with Mucha Chironga of Nedbank. We'll see you then. Take care.